Global Fund. A very good morning and welcome to the program, Mr. Musoke.
Good morning.
How are we doing?
Thank you for having us.
Bring us up to speed with everything Global Fund as we speak right now, including the next, or rather latest, financing cycle. Yes.
All right. Thank you. So I think for viewers, to start with, what is the Global Fund?
Yeah, sure.
You know, in full, the name is Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. So it's essentially a partnership framework, like you just said, to help boost countries' efforts to fight the three diseases. And as you said, 55 billion over the last 20 years. It's really a remarkable partnership, investing in health service delivery. So that's where we are. You know, $14.25 billion raised in this last replenishment, a little less than we had expected. But given the economic conditions globally, that was to be, you know, expected. For Uganda, we will be receiving $587 million. We've been allocated $587 million with a chance to get an additional 17, so that bringing it to $600 million.
Okay.
So we're excited about what we need to do to help HIV, TB, and malaria.
Talking about excitement to be able to intervene effectively in fighting these deadliest diseases, we cannot move away or dismiss the fact that the Global Fund itself has had a little bit of shortfalls here and there. What does the new replenishment mean in terms of covering shortfalls or even attending effectively to the rollout issues, including corruption?
Well, I think a couple of issues there. Much as we fell short of the 18 billion goal that President Biden had set globally, this was still 14.25 billion, higher than it has been in previous replenishments. So I just want to underscore that it fell short of the goal, but it's still the highest we've had in previous cycles. If you look at the Global Fund strategy over the next 5 years, fighting pandemics and building a healthier and equitable world, it's really looking at how do we build resilience in our pandemic systems. And Global Fund is pretty clear that they'll be looking at how countries are prioritizing these investments, but it's also pretty clear that they expect to see country governments also investing more in health service delivery.
So it's not a case of governments waiting entirely for the Global Fund to do the replenishment or the funding. They are expecting equal
from the countries
effort.
As well.
And how is that possible? So how much, for example, is Uganda putting to it, and do we have the will to ensure that actually that money is effective? Have the mechanisms been put in place? Because looking here, you are the chairperson of the coordinating mechanism. Now, within the construct of the word mechanism, does it allow or ensure that you monitor effectively what the government brings on board?
Yeah, so the country coordinating mechanism, like you said, is a partnership board comprised of 17 board seats, representatives from the government, finance, Ministry of Health, local government, Uganda AIDS Commission, civil society, private sector, people living with HIV, TB, and malaria, key populations, academia, and faith-based, and then, of course, the development partners who invest. So the importance of those 17 board seats means that you have everyone within all the sectors in the country represented in the investment of these funds. So people keep saying, oh, government of Uganda, we're just waiting for donors. That's actually not entirely true. If you look at the budgets over the last maybe 3, 4, 5 years, Uganda government has invested 2.5 trillion and more just in the health sector alone. So it's not a matter of just waiting.
On donors.
In fact, by the way, Uganda government is a donor to the Global Fund as well. That replenishment was asking governments, how much are you going to give to the Global Fund? So we're both a recipient and a donor.
Explain that a little bit more.
So
Are we donors because we are paying an annual fee, or we can actually say this year the government of Uganda is putting this particular amount of money to help the Global Fund intervene in other areas across the world? Is that the...
Yeah, so the replenishment, you know, like President Biden set out 18 billion, we're going to ask country governments all over the world, from the United States all the way down to small countries like Uganda, to pledge money towards this replenishment. Okay. So President Biden asked countries, the last time you pledged 14 billion. I'm asking you to increase by 30%. Uganda actually went over and above, where very few countries went over and above, and we pledged 50%. We increased our donation to Global Fund from $2 million to $3 million. You know, so one of the few countries that did that. So I just wanted to underscore that, you know, the commitment of government to also give to the Global Fund much as we also receive as a grantee as well. Yeah.
Wow, that is interesting. Now, talking about the shortfalls, especially when it comes to donors responding to what is no doubt a very tight economy globally. It is something you can understand. The fact that replenishments are coming through for the Global Fund is something of a positive, especially when other countries are, you know, constrained to be able to provide. Within the fight against HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, as is here, are we entirely looking at Global Fund, or Global Fund is part of a cluster of funds that are available for this fight?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think people sometimes don't exactly know the impact of Global Fund. So next to government of Uganda and the US government through PEPFAR and the President's Malaria Initiative for Malaria, next to government of Uganda and the US government, Global Fund is the third largest donor for health service delivery in this country for the 3 diseases, and also for our you know, health system strengthening. So it's not just Global Fund, but it's the third largest next to the government and the US government. Yeah.
All right, so let me go now into the nitty-gritty of the fight against these diseases. Malaria alone is responsible for a loss to Africa of $4.3 billion annually, and most of this also goes into affecting other aspects, especially schools and how students go into the learning. When the statistics are grim, then the planning is also green. You know, where are we when it comes to eradicating these diseases? Because we know there have been timelines set for HIV, timelines set for tuberculosis, timelines set for malaria, and the interventions by Global Fund and any other entity are but efforts. So where are the timelines? Are we on track, or it is a case of every year we are pleading for more and more and more to be able to fight it?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Looking at what has been going on in terms of our disease burden, so we are actually on track for the various goals set for malaria elimination and TB and also HIV, you know, the 2030 goals. Uganda is actually one of the few countries for HIV that had already met the 90-90-90 goals that UNAIDS had set for HIV towards 2030. So we are on track, but I have to say that the COVID pandemic did affect not just Uganda but other countries as well. And so we are looking at Global Fund and PEPFAR and government of Uganda to invest more in rebuilding the health system for resilience, so we can get over what has happened with COVID. And unfortunately for Uganda, we've also had then Ebola come in and disrupt the health system. But it's really testament to the government that COVID, Ebola, and we're still moving forward as Uganda.
All right. I was reading something about a national dialogue that is part of the efforts that are underway. Just bring us up to speed with that.
Yeah. So the national dialogue, which is happening this week, is actually one, you know, to your question of how do we plan and how do we ensure that we understand our issues as we prioritize funds. The national dialogue this week is is really a chance for us to get to understand where are we with malaria, TB, and HIV right now, and where do we need to invest these funds. As I told you before, $600 million is not enough to solve all of Uganda's health problems, and so we have to prioritize. So this week, Wednesday and Thursday, we're going to be having a deep dive discussion. What does HIV, TB, and malaria look like? How has COVID affected our health system? And where do we need to invest in the next 3 years?
One would say that the conversations that you are describing as the deep dive have already been conducted. We pretty much have the statistics. We know the trajectories of the diseases, and we have interventions going on. What, again, how different is this particular deep dive, as you call it, from the rest of the conferences, symposia, and workshops that have been held before?
Fair question. So 2 things, or maybe 3 things. One is epidemiology transforms, right? We can't, where we were 3 years ago is not necessarily where we are right now. So that's one, a chance for us to say, what does it look like right now in terms of malaria, HIV, and TB? How did COVID affect us? How has Ebola affected our health system? So that's one. 2, like we discussed earlier, is funding landscape has changed. I'm sure you read in the newspapers, donors are starting to talk about transition. You know, the war in Ukraine has also affected some donors' ability. You know, governments are dealing with post-COVID, and in Uganda, post-Ebola. So it's important that we don't just say, oh, we already know.
That's right.
But we come and update ourselves on where do we stand financially and where do we stand disease burden-wise.
Okay. Wow, there's a lot, of course, to look forward to in terms of the fight against HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. One thing I would like to emphasize is that tuberculosis seems to be less projected when it comes to many of these efforts, to the extent that the average Ugandan, for example, has fallen into the trap of paying little attention to tuberculosis. But it remains one of the killers. I know you're not a direct public health expert to tell me where we are, especially when it comes to prevalence and stuff like that. But within the greater scheme of things, what is the disease that, if we looked at, for example, settling the rest, which is that disease that is most prevalent, the one that affects especially the lower persons? One would say HIV is rampant, yes, no doubt, but there are diseases that are far more dangerous and doing a lot to the people's ability to produce and transform the country that we might not paying attention to. Does Global Fund conduct research in that?
Yes. Not just Global Fund, but really the countries themselves. In country, within Uganda, we are consistently or constantly conducting research on our disease burden and understanding the patterns of the disease. Now, everyone, you know, knows HIV and can tell you HIV is a problem for the country. But malaria really is one of those silent killers. People really underestimate malaria. They think it's as simple as just going to a drug shop and getting drugs. But malaria is dangerous and in fact continues to kill more people than would like, especially, you know, children under 5. To your question of TB, yes, you're right. You know, the average person hasn't necessarily understood the danger of TB and the impact of TB. And so, you know, the government, through the National TB and Leprosy Program, has actually been on a drive to educate the public that TB is dangerous and this is what you should know about TB. They've made huge investments in community systems, like getting down to the communities so that people understand at that community level it's not just a national problem, but at a community level, TB is a problem for us. In fact, just one small thing. If you look at our allocation for this next 3 years, the TB we've increased the funding for TB, recognizing the importance of really moving to eradication. Yeah.
All right, let's, as we enter the final bend, it's inevitable. Many times the uncomfortable questions have to be asked.
Yeah.
The Global Fund has had its reputation, especially in light of what happened with the two ministers, Mike Mukula and Jim Muhwezi. What happened thereafter is not something that we ought to discuss, but there is concern across Africa that the wage bill on many of these projects takes up the resources that are supposed to actually be, making the difference within the communities or the affected persons. Within the mechanism of the country coordinating mechanism, which you are the chairperson, the Global Fund ought to be seen as one that is departing from that line of doing things. Cars, huge offices, to actually building the infrastructure and putting the resources to the people. How is this being arrived at?
You've actually answered the question. In terms of Global Fund investments, if you look at the breakdown of where Global Fund has invested, most of that money has gone towards commodities. So test kits for HIV, test kits for malaria, medicines for HIV, TB, and malaria, and building health system. Things like the National Medical Stores warehouse that we just launched in November, buying machines, incinerators, and all of that. The reason why Global Fund is able to do that is really around the country coordinating mechanism. You have the civil society represented, you have other development partners represented, and you have government. It's not just government making the decisions on where these monies go. You have all other partners coming in. And so that's a check on some of these ills you've mentioned.
All right. In 5 seconds, where is the deep dive dialogue going to be held?
Yeah, so the deep dive dialogue will be at Protea Hotel this week. But we're really encouraging people. We'll be sharing the Zoom link on our social media pages. We're really encouraging people to dial in that way, because that's more manageable in terms of the numbers.
That's right. Andrew Musoke, board chairperson of the country coordinating mechanism for the Global Fund in the fight against tuberculosis, HIV, and malaria. Many thanks for the insight and the perspective on the latest in that particular fight. We shall now go for a short break and return with our Kickstarter discussion, where the budget framework paper for the year 2023, budget 2023-2024 is up, and the discussion will be, of course, taken on by Julius Mukunda. He is the Executive Director at CS Park. Stay with us. We'll be right back.